I grew up in a prison town. That town was Chester, Illinois. And I remember when we would drive home from church, we would pass signs that said, "Do not park or pick up hitchhikers on prison property." Chester is the place where Menard Penitentiary is, and there were a lot of very famous people who were in Menard. It's also the place in Illinois where the only maximum security facility for mentally ill people is located. Perhaps as a result of being raised in a prison town, I was afraid of prisoners and I was afraid of prisons. One day, about 3 or 4 years ago, a woman who had been baptized here in our congregation some 30 or more years ago came to the front door of First Presbyterian Church. Her name was Sandra Baumgartner. Sandra had driven up from Tennessee, and she had stopped here at the church and wanted to talk to me before she went to her home. So when she sat down in my office, she told me that she had stopped in a church on her way from Tennessee to Elgin, and that she had been saved. She also came and began to worship with us, and she was here in worship with us for about 2 months, almost every Sunday. I had many conversations with her during those couple of months that she came. But then one day, I found out some terrible news. I found out that Sandra had murdered her sister. I did not understand how that could have possibly happened, but it shook me to my bones. And even though I have always been afraid of prisons and of prisoners, I decided I would begin to visit her at Kane County Jail. And I kept visiting her for 3.5 years. Today we're going to hear Jesus' first sermon, the sermon he delivered in Nazareth. And he has quite a bit to say in that sermon about captivity and being in prison. So listen with me to our scripture passage today in Luke chapter 4, starting with verse 14. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and as was his custom, he stood up and read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release from the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And then he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did in Capernaum.'" And he said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, except to a widow in Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them were cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. Before I visited Sandra, I had never visited anyone in prison. Although I had gone to the prison in my hometown as a band member in high school for performances. And I remember vividly, as I walked in, I could hear the sound of doors behind me clicking shut, locking behind me. And I also remember vividly the guards that came to escort us through and how they watched us all, worried that maybe we perhaps would do something. I felt like I was being watched. I even felt like I was in prison when I went to visit a prison. And so I just avoided them until a few years ago. Jesus has quite a lot to say about captivity in this sermon that he gave in Nazareth that day. He had been out and about before he came to Nazareth. He had a very, very good reputation for healing and teaching in all the towns around. So when he showed up in his hometown of Nazareth to give teaching, everyone was waiting to see what he might do that day. He opened up the scroll of Isaiah and he read to them those words that you heard in our scripture today. The words proclaiming that he had come to release the captives, to give sight to the blind, and to proclaim the Lord's favor. However, he went on with other words that they did not like to hear. They were probably wondering if he was saying that he was the Messiah that was to come for Israel, the Messiah who was going to free Israel from their captivity to Rome. They were wondering, is this who this is? After all, the scripture in Isaiah that Jesus was reading is a scripture about the coming of the Messiah. Instead, Jesus talked about two people in Israel that had been healed by the Lord's prophets, Elijah and Elisha. Neither one of those two people were Jews. Both of them were Gentiles. And Jesus also points this out very vividly to them. This was not good news to the people in that synagogue. In fact, they got so upset with Jesus that they threw him out of the synagogue and took him out to the brow of a hill and tried to push him over the cliff. I remember when I was in seminary, one of my homiletics professors said to me, "Don't make your first sermon like this." Well, Sandra, I believe, is a person who, if Jesus would have come to town some 4 years ago in late summer, Jesus would have visited Sandra. She would have been one of the people that he would have seen, because I believe that Jesus would have seen in her captivity. He would have seen that she was captive to mental illness. I did not see that, not even for a moment. During all of those times that I spoke to her, I did not see it. And I am a trained social worker. And so when I found out what had happened, I was so distressed, because I wondered, of course, if perhaps I had seen anything. I might have been able to say something, but I do not. The people that Jesus was referring to in his sermon in Nazareth are what are called the downtrodden in the Hebrew Scripture. And the word downtrodden is literally translated as shattered and smashed. So when Jesus said, I have come to bring good news, he was saying he was bringing good news to the shattered and the smashed people in the land. And Sandra was one of those people, even though I did not know it at the time. We encounter people like that in our world too. Sometimes we see them on our streets. They are the people who have been kicked into the corners of our streets, huddling to try to stay warm. They are the people who are locked up in our prisons or rotting on our borders. These are the shattered and smashed people that Jesus was bringing good news to. But the people in Nazareth, they probably thought they should have been getting the good news themselves. After all, they were poor. They were very poor. They had lost all of their land. They had been taken captive by the Roman Empire. Many of them were barely making it. Their status as Jews was constantly being threatened. Why couldn't they be the ones that God would rescue and the Messiah would come to save? That is why when he talked to them about the Gentiles, they just couldn't take it. They had to get him out of the synagogue. When I started visiting Sandra, since I'd never visited anyone in prison, I really didn't know what to do. I was a pastor, so I wondered if perhaps I was supposed to listen to her confession, or I wondered if I was supposed to hear about what happened, that she would say that she was sorry. These kinds of things would go through my mind. But instead, once a month, when I would go over to the Kane County Jail, I would go downstairs to where there were a bunch of television screens. I never actually saw Sandra in person when I visited. I sat in front of a box called a Viz box, and she was in front of a box in another building talking to me. She could see me, I could see her, but she was a long way away from me. I never could really touch her. And she was not interested in talking about all the things that had happened when she became so violently upset that day. No. She wanted to talk about her life. She wanted to know about me, too. She wanted to know about our church. So every time I went to visit her, her first question was, what's going on in church? And she knew some of your names because she was here when she was younger, and she would ask about you. And then there were a few of you who sent her cards, Ellen in particular, and she would always ask about Ellen. How is Ellen doing? How's the Sunday school? How many kids are in the Sunday school class? What are they studying? This was the kind of thing she wanted to know about. She wanted to know where I went on vacation. And then when she talked about herself, she didn't talk about the past. She talked about the food she had for lunch. She talked about things that happened inside the prison there. And she talked about her day-to-day activities. Once in a while, we would venture off and talking about her case or her lawyer or such, but that was pretty rare. So I have to admit that during all those times I was visiting her, during those 3 years of visiting her over once a month and spending half an hour with with her and a screen, I did not know if anything was helping. That was a question that was always going on in my mind. Am I really doing anything here? Am I really helping? I mean, what can I do? But it seemed that as the days and the weeks and the months rolled on, I was becoming more fond of her, and that feeling deepened. So the last time I saw Sandra was when she was standing before the judge to be sentenced. It was last summer. So I sat there. Actually, I sat down right behind her in the courtroom. Courtroom was completely empty, except for 2 or 3 people and me. And I listened to the judge describe to Sandra the sentence. Sandra had been sentenced to 30 years without parole. It had been increased from 25 years because the state's attorney was concerned that she might live past 25 years. And so he made it 30 with no parole. And then the judge began to explain to Sandra why she had received this sentence. And the judge began to read her very, very thick stack of mental health documents that went back for over 20 years. And when she got to the point where she was talking about what had happened 3 years ago, she said this, straight from the medical records. She described how Sandra had come from Tennessee to Illinois, and she was on a medication that was keeping her mental illness stable. But then when she arrived in Illinois and she went to a mental health facility here, they discovered that her insurance would not pay for that medication. It was too expensive. And so 1 week before she committed the murder, her medication was changed to a cheaper medication. And then it was discovered that that medication did not work. Did not work. In fact, her sister, who was the person who was caring for her, had called the facility where Sandra was receiving mental health services one day before the murder, asking for help, and no one came that day either. So then the judge explained to Sandra, since she had no one in the world to look after her now, because there were no family members that could help her, then she had to stay in prison because she was not stable enough to be on medicine and to be in the world. And that's why the sentence had to be so long and without parole. Then the judge asked Sandra to make a statement. This is the first time I had heard Sandra speak in court. I had gone to monthly court hearings where all that would happen would be she would come in and then there would be a continuance. It would last about 1 or 2 minutes and then I would leave. But on this occasion, for the very first time, she was invited to speak. So she got up and she began to say how sorry she was about what had happened. She felt absolutely terrible. She just wanted to apologize. She knew she couldn't apologize. She knew she couldn't take it back. And after she began to tell that story, she started to sob so violently that I was sitting right behind her, and I reached my hand to touch her shoulder. And the bailiff that was sitting over here leaped up and came over and pulled my hand back. And then there was a recess because she was so out of control in the courtroom. people in Nazareth, when Jesus told him about releasing the captives, and he talked about the Gentiles, they were not happy about that because it didn't include them. And so they became so unhappy about that they decided that the Gentiles should not be receiving grace. And they threw him out. Sandra has taught me some very important lessons about grace. I believe that one day Sandra will be released from her captivity. That doesn't mean that I believe she will ever leave the prison. But I do believe that she will be released because I believe the words of Jesus to those people in the synagogue that day. He came to release the captives. You know, all of us have had some kind of captivity in our life. We have had some kind of burden like that, whether it is a grief that won't let us go or a shame of something that we did or someone else did to us, or a hurt that we can't forgive. That kind of bondage is something that all of us have experienced. Sandra's was a bigger bondage, and it seemed more complete. But Sandra taught me that grace still abounds, even in the presence of bondage. She taught me that grace can overflow into the life of someone, even in her position, even in prison. She knows of us. She knows we love her. And furthermore, I found out that all of those visits that I made to her mattered. They mattered. Because I could bring just a whisper of hope or even joy, maybe just for a moment or a day. That matters. When we withhold grace from anyone, we end up not receiving it ourselves, because God pours out grace to everyone. And all of us can be part of God's plans through Jesus to release the captives and to support and give grace to everyone.